This audio production was made in collaboration with Audible Anarchist.
Chapter 21: Roman Centralization and its Influence. Whenever we speak of Greece, we also think of Rome, an association of ideas that is established in our school days. Our concept of classic antiquity embraces Greeks and Romans as peoples of the same cultural circle. We speak of a Greco-Roman culture period, and associate with this the idea of profound interconnections which never existed, never could have existed. It is true that we were told of certain characters distinguishing the Greeks from the Romans. Against the cheerful independence of the Greeks, we were shown the stern sense of duty of the Romans. Roman virtue, wrapped in its coarse toga, served us in some measure as antithesis to the frank joy of living in Hellas. Above all, however, the schools praised the highly developed political sense of the Romans, which enabled them to forge the whole Italian peninsula into a firm political unity, a thing the Greeks could never accomplish in their own country. And all this was so presented to us as to convey with certainty the impression that Romanism was merely a necessary extension of the Grecian conception of life, which, in a sense, it merely carried to its conclusion. Without doubt, there were connections between the Hellenic and the Roman culture, but these were of a purely superficial nature, and had not the slightest relation to the peculiar modes of thought or the intellectual and cultural aspirations of the two peoples. Even if there were available proofs of the view that the Greeks and the Romans are to be regarded as descendants of the same people, one which in prehistoric times had its dwelling in the middle Danube basin, and of whom they say one part wandered into the Balkans, while the other forced its way into the Apennine Peninsula, this still would be no proof of the interdependence of the Greek and the Roman cultures. The very wide difference in the social development of the two peoples would in that event merely show that different environments had influenced decisively the hereditary characteristics of the Greeks and the Romans, and forced the course of their social life into different paths. Concerning the primitive history of the Romans, we know no more than about the early home of the Grecian tribes. With them, too, everything fades into the thick haze of mythological tradition. Famous authorities on Roman history, like for example Theodor Mommsen, even maintain that many of these legends, especially the myth of the founding of the city of Rome by the brothers Romulus and Remus, were invented much later with the conscious political purpose of giving a national Roman stamp to institutions taken over from the Etruscans, and to delude the people into a belief in their community of descent. That the peninsula had already in prehistoric times been inundated repeatedly by Germanic and Celtic tribes cannot today be doubted, but in all probability, immigrations from Africa and the Levant by the sea route had also taken place, and this long before the colonization of Sicily and South Italy by the Phoenicians, and a few centuries later by the Greeks. It is certain that the so-called Italic peoples did not belong to the original inhabitants of the peninsula, as was once widely accepted. The Italics were rather a people of Indo-Germanic origin, which had crossed the Alps in a prehistoric time and settled on the plains of the Po Valley. Later, driven out by the Etruscans, they withdrew to the middle and southern parts of the country, where they probably mixed with the Yapigo-Messapians. The time of their entrance is veiled in utter darkness. On their arrival, they encountered the Ligurians, who probably came from Asia Minor. Later, the Ligurians completely vanished from the canvas, but their territories once extended over all the northern part of the peninsula, the Alps, southern France, and as far as northern Spain, where they mixed with the Iberians. Among all the peoples, however, who played a part before the foundation of Rome and exerted very strong influence on the development of Roman civilization, the Etruscans take first place. We are still altogether uncertain about the origin of this remarkable people, since scientific research has not yet succeeded in deciphering their inscriptions. The Etruscan realm extended in early times from the extreme north clear to the banks of the Tiber, which was called by the ancients an Etruscan stream. Their control, undisturbed for centuries, was first broken by the growing power of the Romans. But even at the founding of Rome, they still played an important part. Among the Roman kings, Tarquinius Superbus was expressly designated as Etruscan, while Numa Pompilius and Ancus Marcius were called Sabines by the Roman historiographers. Beyond doubt, the great structures of ancient Rome, the Cloaca Maxima, the Capitoline Temple, and so on, were erected by Etruscan engineers, for none of the Latin tribes were highly enough developed culturally to have accomplished such works. It is now generally accepted that the name Rome is of Etruscan origin and probably goes back to the tribe of the Ruma. In the semi-historical traditions of the Romans, moreover, the Etruscans are mentioned as one of the 3 aboriginal peoples to whom they ascribed the founding of the city. From all this, it follows that the Romans proper enter history as an already mixed people, in whose veins circulated the blood of several races. The immediate occurrences which led to the founding of the city of Rome lie wholly in the dark. Many historians are of the opinion that the founding of the city can be traced back to the ver sacrum, the sacred springtime, a widespread custom among the Latin tribes, in obedience to which the young men of 20 years of age left their old place of habitation to establish elsewhere a home of their own. Many cities arose through this custom, and it is not impossible that Rome owes its existence to it. It is also clear from the traditions that the Palatine Hill was the first settled, while the other 6 hills were added to the city only subsequently, and were, in fact, held by different tribes. The merging of these settlements into the city of Rome followed much later, and we are not in a position to establish historically its immediate causes. Probably force played a considerable part in it, a view that gains credence from the ancient tradition that the tribal fathers of the city of Rome gathered about them all sorts of fugitives to whom the young settlement offered an asylum. The legend of the rape of the Sabine women also indicates that the first colonists were no very pleasant neighbors. Very little of the primitive history of the Romans is known to us, but that little shows clearly that they were a people of farmers and cattle breeders. Their social life was based on the so-called Gentile system. The separate family clans gradually united with others into tribal organizations, from which, in time, there proceeded a federation of tribes, which had bound themselves together into a union for defense and offense. The community, out of which Rome later arose, exhibited a political unity in which, just as among the Greeks, along with the new political forms, strong remnants of the old Gentile system survived for a long time. In general, the transformation from purely social union to political organization was accomplished only very gradually, in fact, about in the measure that the natural union of the old Gentile system was loosened by the institution of private property, and the family achieved an influence which delivered all power into the hands of the head of the family. Thus, the ancient customary law was more and more displaced by the enactments of the state, which gradually grew into the Roman law. These inner transformations, of course, affected also the relations with neighboring communities. It is easily seen that with the rapid growth of the city, its lands would soon become inadequate for the production of foodstuffs to meet the needs of the inhabitants. Thus, the first hostilities with the neighbors may have arisen. So we have the first battles growing out of the desire to conquer the land of the neighboring communities, and to make these subject to Rome. But the conquered territories must be held and must be safeguarded against uprisings of the old population, and this could be accomplished only by a strong military organization, in the development of which the Roman state little by little completely sunk itself. There was built up a new system of outspokenly militaristic character. Formerly, responsibility for public affairs had rested on the popular assembly, the comitia curiata, which was still made up after the pattern of the ancient Gentile system, but already under Numa, the successor of Romulus, influences were at work which led to decisive alterations in the system, and tended strongly to give it a purely political character. The preconditions for this transformation are to be looked for in those internal divisions of Roman society into classes, which were already plainly noticeable under the earliest kings. It is sheer nonsense to try and see in patricians and plebeians members of 2 different races which held toward one another in some measure the relation of conquerors and conquered. The simple fact that some of the descendants of the same family might belong to the patricians and others to the plebeians disposes of this view. In reality, we are here dealing with 2 very different social statuses, which grew out of the system of private property and of the inequality of economic conditions. In this view, the patricians are to be regarded as the representatives of the big farmers, while the plebeians were gathered from the ranks of the small farmers, who, in consequence of the increasing inequality of possessions, came ever more and more under the yoke of their rich fellow citizens. The society of earliest Rome was divided into family clans, each headed by a chieftain or king clothed with the powers at once of high priest and general. Beside the king, there stood the council of the leading men of the clans, on whom rested the actual guidance of the affairs of the community. Because of the close relation between the king and the leading men, it was altogether natural that he should select his officials from their ranks. Because of the economic preponderance of the big farmers, it resulted that they came gradually to hold all the important offices and used them to foster and build up their own interests and privileges, so that the poorer part of the population was brought more and more under their mastery. Out of this situation developed the first beginnings of a caste of nobility, which worked for the abolishment of the old Gentile system so that the conquest of foreign territories might proceed more systematically. These undertakings were definitely begun under Numa, but it was not until the time of Servius Tullius that there occurred the great about-face by which Roman society acquired that unique political stamp. The city of Rome became the focus of all the surrounding and the conquered territories. In the place of the ancient institutions, there arose a political military structure based on 5 classes with unequally apportioned rights. The council of leading men was replaced by the Senate, in which only patricians had seat and voice, being thus raised to the status of a hereditary aristocracy. The different classes were divided into military centuries, kept always ready for service in war. In place of the old comitia curiata came the comitia centuriata, corresponding to this new division. Each class had its separate centuries. Their relative electoral weight was determined by their possessions. There is no doubt that by this new division the people were shamefully cheated. Still, because remnants of the old order were cunningly mixed with the new, most of them were unaware of it. Thus came into being that aristocratic democratic state system, the internal organization of which was based on conquest and spoliation. The whole peoples was welded into an army, and the government pursued with relentless persistence its aim of bringing the whole peninsula under Roman rule and forging it into a vast political unity. Only from this point of view can the relation between patricians and plebeians be rightly judged. It would be quite the reverse of the truth to try to see in the plebeians merely an oppressed class, whose efforts were directed at the abolition of privilege and the establishment of a new economic order. They were not thinking of anything of the sort. Rather, their sole concern was to become participants in the privileges of the patricians and obtain an equal share of the spoils of war. There was no fundamental difference between the two ranks. They were equally obsessed by the Roman spirit. Both were ready to make slaves and to oppress other peoples. Both strove for the same opportunities for exploitation. But the military character of the Roman state, ever bent on conquest, actually brought it about that the patricians had to yield to the demands of the plebs. They did not do this willingly. They defended their privileges with obstinate determination, even forbidding marriage between patricians and plebeians. In consequence of the state's cold-blooded policy of conquest, especially in the era of the Republic, ever heavier demands were laid upon the poorer population, and the gulf between the two classes was constantly widened. However, the Roman policy demanded soldiers. It was this necessity which had gradually compelled the patricians to share their privileges with the plebs. Along with these concessions, there was set up a new nobility to support that imperial world policy which was to bring all important countries of the then-known world under the power of Rome, and build up the Roman state into that frightful plunder machine which in all the history of the peoples of the earth has no parallel. Some historians assert that it was during the reign of the emperors that Rome first became the robber's cave of the world, into the insatiable mouth of which the freedom and the wealth of peoples disappeared. Without doubt, what they called the Roman spirit was most effective under the empire. But one must be blind not to recognize that the poisonous bloom of Caesarism was sown in the time of the Republic. In it were prepared the indispensable preliminaries for every possible further development of unlimited power. Under the Republic arose the fateful institution of the dictatorship, which justified on principle every abuse of power and smothered at its birth every liberty of man. The Constitution of the Republic placed 2 consuls at the head of the state, who were armed with all the powers of the former kings. In emergencies, the consuls, with the consent of the Senate, could appoint a dictator who was clothed with unlimited authority. The dictator had the right to suspend all existing laws and to demand from all officials of the state unconditional obedience. He could suspend all those rights of freedom and security guaranteed to citizens by the Constitution. Only a state which was based entirely on war and the subjugation of other peoples could have called into being such a terrible institution. From dictatorship to Caesarism is only a step. The empire was merely the ripened fruit of a system which had established power as the basic principle of life. Hegel was entirely right when he said that Rome was from the very beginning an artificial, forced, not primeval thing, and that the Roman state, geographically and historically, rested on the impetus of violence. The will to power, in which the spirit of Rome is so perfectly embodied, created that gruesome ideology which debases the individual into the spiritless tool of the state, the insensate automaton of a higher power, which justifies every means for the realization of its aims. The much-praised Roman virtue was never anything else than state slavery raised to a principle, and stupid selfishness unmitigated by a trace of sympathy. Both flourished in Republican Rome quite as luxuriantly as in the Rome of the Caesars. Even Niebuhr, who is in general an unrestrained admirer of the Roman state policy, states in his Roman History that, "From the earliest times down the most frightful vices prevailed, insatiable lust of power, conscienceless contempt for the rights of foreigners, unfeeling indifference to the sufferings of strangers, avarice, robbery, and a settled exclusiveness, from which arose a quite inhuman hard-heartedness, not only towards slaves but even towards fellow citizens." The pillars of the Roman state were calculating and methodical in their policy. They shrunk from no baseness, no infamy, no treachery, no breach of faith which promised advantage to their plans. They were the real inventors of the reason of state, which in the course of time has grown into a frightful curse to every principle of humanity and justice. Not for nothing was a she-wolf the symbol of Rome. The Roman state, in truth, had wolf blood in its veins. Though at first the subjugation of the Italian peninsula was the aim of Roman policy, there appeared quite logically after its attainment that ambition for world dominion which has such unmistakable attraction for every state with pretensions to power. The Italian peninsula, with its long coastline, was too freely exposed to the attacks of hostile powers to permit the inauguration of any larger plans until the country was politically united and well fortified. The entire mainland is by nature a great geographic unit, and the principal aim of the crafty Roman policy was directed toward converting this geographical unity into a political unity. By a series of internal wars, one people after another was made subject to the Roman state. In general, the treatment accorded these Italian tribes by the conquerors was milder than that which they later practiced towards other subjugated peoples. This was clearly owing to well-considered political reasons, for the Roman statesmen dared not imperil their rulership over the Italian mainland by continual uprisings of the conquered populations, if they were to pursue further their high-flown plans, hence their tenderness. The eruptions of the Gauls favored this cunning policy, since it made the indigenous populations so much the more dependent on the protection of Rome. Thus there developed in the course of time a feeling of closer cohesiveness that gradually solidified into the national idea. Not only in Rome, but over the whole peninsula, men felt themselves to be Romans. Only after the political unification of the mainland had been accomplished could Roman policy set itself to larger undertakings, which its leaders then pursued with unscrupulous greed and stern persistence, never allowing themselves to be frightened off by temporary setbacks. With these wider aims before their eyes, there grew in the Romans an inner assurance of their strength, and that peculiar arrogance towards other peoples which is characteristic of world conquerors. Rome, once she became the focus of the world, believed herself rightfully called upon to subject all other peoples to her rulership. Her successes won for her a historic mission, long before Hegel set this notion at the foundation of his theory of history. In the Aeneid, the national epic of the Romans, Virgil gave this fixed idea a poetic expression. "Others will polish more charmingly bronzes that stand as if breathing, carve, I am certain, as easily, faces in marble as lifelike, plead in the courts with an eloquence finer, and measure with gnomon courses of stars in the heavens, and tell us the hours of their rising. Be thou, O Roman, concerned about wielding world-mastering power. Thine be such arts then, and after thine be it to scorn and to strike down proudly the man who would set up a world where the people are peaceful." After the fall of Carthage and Corinth, these ideas grew with the Romans to an inner conviction, a sort of political religion. So arose gradually that monstrous mechanism of the Roman state, supported by force and plunder, which Kropotkin described in striking words. The Roman dominion was a state in the true sense of the word. To our own day it remains the ideal of the legislator and the legal expert. Its institutions covered a mighty realm, as with a fine meshed net. Everything converged on Rome: economic life, military life, legal relations, property, education, even religion. From Rome came the laws, the judges, the legions to protect the country, the office holders, the gods. The collective life of the realm culminated in the Senate, later in the Caesar, the all-powerful and all-knowing, the god of the realm. Every province, every district had its tiny capital, its fragments of the Roman sovereign, which guided its collective life. A single law imposed from Rome ruled throughout the realm. This realm was in no sense a union of citizens. It was a herd of subjects. In fact, Rome was the state par excellence, the state which was completely bent upon a gigantic centralization of all social forces. No other state has been able to maintain so long its worldwide dominion. No state has exerted such a commanding influence on the later political development of Europe and upon the form of its legal institutions. And that influence has even today not completely vanished. In the years since the World War it has even increased. The idea of Rome, as Schlegel called it, is still the basis of the policy of all modern big states, even when the forms of this policy have taken on a different appearance. If everywhere in the history of Greece we meet with the spirit of autonomy and complete national dismemberment, in Rome we find from the very outset the idea of an all-embracing political unity, which found its most perfect expression in the Roman state. No other empire developed the idea of political unity to such a degree and planted it so deeply in actual life. It runs through all of Roman history and forms, so to speak, the leitmotif of its collective content. Of course, Rome never thought of granting to the conquered lands outside of the Italian peninsula, which were incorporated into the realm as provinces, political or national rights of any kind. The foreigner, even when his country had been conquered by the Romans, was utterly without rights in Rome. It is characteristic of the mode of thought of the Romans that their language had for the ideas foreigner and enemy only the one word, hostis. It is, moreover, an entirely erroneous notion that the Roman state concerned itself only with the economic exploitation of the subject peoples, and in other respects was guided in its treatment of the conquered by cosmopolitan ideas. Hand in hand with military and political subjugation went the Romanizing of the conquered territories, and this was carried out with implacable consistency. Only towards religions did the Romans display a certain broad-mindedness, so long as these were in no way dangerous to their supremacy. And in this connection we must not forget that in Rome even religion was completely subordinated to the purposes of the state. There was therefore no church which could stand out as a rival to the state. Every cult was under the supervision of the state. The Senate regulated all religious affairs, as is clear from innumerable decrees. The priests were subordinate officers of the state, and besides, the highest priestly positions were all in the hands of the leading statesmen or of the Senate. To a world dominion like Rome, every cult is equally acceptable so long as it subordinates itself to the state. Alexander of Macedon had already given an instructive example in this respect by making toleration of foreign religious systems an instrument of political power. He rendered to Apis of the Egyptians, or to the god of the Jews, the same honor as to Zeus of the Greeks. Such a toleration, remarks Mautner, which was really indifference, became first with the Romans a genuine instrument of their permanent imperialism, their policy of world conquest. If, however, a religion became bothersome or actually dangerous to the state, tolerance quickly ended, and persecution set in. This was the basis of the attacks on the early Christians, whose doctrines struck at the very foundations of the empire, and who refused to render divine honors to the person of the emperor. Religious persecutions in Rome always sprang from political motives. The religion of the Romans displayed little that was primitive. They borrowed elements of religious faith from every possible people and incorporated them in their own body of ideas. It is today the fairly unanimous opinion that they derived a large part of their ancient cult from the Etruscans. This is especially true of their belief in demons and of the meticulously regulated ceremonial of their worship, which played a part in every phase of their daily life. Elisée Reclus remarks pointedly, "The ceremonials of the tribunals, the governmental palaces, the temples, the private dwellings, which the Romans followed almost without change for centuries, were likewise adopted from the Etruscans. From whatever point of view one regards it, one cannot avoid the conclusion that the Roman people was nourished on the substance of the Etruscans, much like those insects which find their food already in the brood cells which have been prepared for them." In no case can one identify the religion of the Romans with that of the Hellenes, as is so often done. It is true that there are found in their cult many borrowings from the Greeks. The same is true for a number of their gods, but one cannot infer from this an essential relation between the two religions. A sober, unpoetic people like the Romans had no understanding at all of the cheerful activity of the Greek Olympus. The free, spontaneous behavior of the Hellenic gods was hard to harmonize with the Roman sense of order. Religion meant to the Romans spiritual bondage, as is revealed in the very derivation of the word. Bondage, however, simply did not go down with the Hellenes. In this sense, they were not religious. Zeus was to them simply the father of the gods, otherwise endowed with exactly the same excellences and the same weaknesses as all the other gods. The dignified Jupiter of the Romans, however, was quite especially the guardian god of the capital and of the Roman state. The polytheism of the Greeks was the product of a poetically illumined mysticism, in which the various natural forces were embodied in the individual divinities. Among the Romans, the divinity often embodied nothing more than an abstract principle with a practical application. Thus, they had gods of the frontier, of concord, of welfare, of theft, of pestilence, of fevers, of contentment, of worry, to whom the faithful could resort in special cases. The residences of the gods were arranged just like the Roman state. Each god had his particular post, where nobody else had any business. For the Roman religion, like everything else, was designed to be practical and purposive. Their whole cult exhausted itself in a ritual as rigid as it was spiritless. Even the cults of the Egyptians, the Syrians, the Persians, and others, which later found a home among the Romans, had to adapt themselves to the peculiar character of the Roman state. The idea of political unity stood among the Romans ahead of every other consideration, a firm article of faith which must not be distorted and need not be explained. If the assertion were true that national or political unity is the indispensable condition for the unhampered cultural development of a people, then the Romans should have overshadowed completely all other peoples in history as to both creative power and cultural activity, for among no other people were these concepts so firmly and so universally held as among them. Furthermore, the dominance of Rome extended through a period of 1,200 years. No other world power has lasted so long. Therefore, no one can assert that the Romans did not have sufficient time to bring their cultural capabilities to full development. In spite of this, not even the most fanatical admirer of the Roman state and the political genius of the Romans would venture to assert that they were a culturally creative people, or that they could be compared, even in a dream, with the nationally and politically completely disunited Hellenes. The mere thought of such a comparison would be treason to all culture. All distinguished minds, whose mental vision has not been dimmed by the will to power, are agreed that the Romans were, by and large, an unimaginative people with purely political interests, and that because of this purely political obsession, they had no comprehension of the deeper significance of culture. Their actual cultural achievements were of trifling significance. In no field of culture did they make a single outstanding contribution. They remained always a race of imitators. Of course, they knew how to appropriate the creative products of others and to exploit them for their own special ends. At the same time, they always infected them with death germs, for one cannot with impunity constrain cultural effort in political forms. Every people possesses certain creative endowments and capabilities, and it would be ungracious to deny all such to the Romans. But these natural abilities were limited by the external conditions of the social environment and constrained into definite directions. Or, to speak with Nietzsche, every people, just as every man, has control over only a certain total of powers and capacities, and so much of this total as is expended for world dominion or in political effort is necessarily withheld from cultural activity. This is the same thought which Hegel clothed in the words, "The Roman principle was fixed entirely on dominion and military power. It had no intellectual focal point as an aim to occupy and to satisfy the mind." The strained unity of the state structure was not of a type to give free range to the cultural capacities of the Romans. On the contrary, its entire 1,200-year-long history gave conclusive proof that political unity is one thing and creative cultural activity is another thing. The Romans tortured their natural talents to death on the Procrustean bed of political unity. Every creative idea was crippled by the rigid framework of their military and bureaucratic machine. They had made of the state an earthly providence which guides everything, determines everything, decides everything. And in doing this, they smothered at its birth every impulse toward spontaneous, independent activity. They sacrificed the whole world and themselves to this Moloch. The more extended and powerful the Roman state made itself in the course of the centuries, just so much more man shrank in spiritual worth and social importance. Just so much more completely his sense of personality shriveled, and with it his urge to cultural creation, which can endure no political coercion. The Romans reveal this especially in their art, which among every people represents the high point of cultural creativeness. Until after the complete subjugation of all the countries bordering on the Mediterranean, one cannot speak of a Roman art at all. Everything in Rome which could be assigned to the field of representative art up to that time was of either Etruscan or Grecian origin. The influence of the Etruscans is already easily recognizable in the earliest days of Rome. Later, out of the Grecian settlements at the south of the peninsula, there issued this other influx, which for the first time brought the Italic people into close contact with the art of the Hellenes. From the conquest of Greece after the Second Punic War and the forcible incorporation of the country in the Roman realm, came that immediate union which was to be for the Hellenes of a later time a fatality, but which brought into Rome the first forms of a higher culture. The Roman commanders robbed the Greek cities of their most splendid treasures, and dragged off to Rome everything transportable. Of the fabulous wealth of stolen art, treasures we can hardly form a just estimate. Taine informs us in his Philosophy of Art, "When Rome had completely plundered the Grecian world, she possessed a population of statues almost equal to her people. They estimate today the number of the statues which, after all the centuries and all the destructions, have been found in Rome and its environs at more than 60,000. But the Romans had no sort of inner understanding of this art. They decorated their homes and their cities with Greek pictures, somewhat as today rich American upstarts buy Rembrandts and Van Dycks, because they thought they owed it to their station. Whence could they have gotten such an understanding? The glad enjoyment of life of the Oriental Aryans, the joy of the Hellenes in nakedness, in the beauty of human nature, is in its every detail completely alien to the Roman. He has no splendid holiday plays, he honors no poets and writers, and he carries prudery so far that a son-in-law is not allowed to bathe with his father-in-law. What distinguishes the Roman is his intensity, his method. He must know that his house and his state is in order. His family life is strictly regulated, and therefore extremely dull. He names his daughters fifth and sixth, and he puts his son to death if he is disobedient. Unlike most Aryans, he sets a high value on externals, on keeping up appearances. Gravity, dignity, decorum. These are his favorite expressions, words which on the lips of the facetious and undignified Cicero become doubly impressive. Albrecht Wirth, Volkstum und Weltmacht. Holding such a concept of life, it is surely no wonder that the so-called genuine Romans met the intrusion of Greek modes of life always with a certain shyness or even a definite hostility. With many, this aversion took quite particular forms. Thus, Cato the Elder warned his son against Greek physicians, asserting that the Greeks had entered into a conspiracy against the Romans in which the physicians were assigned the duty of poisoning all Roman citizens with their medicines. The same Cato pronounced Socrates a loud-mouthed, turbulent agitator who well deserved his fate. He also prophesied that when Rome had become saturated with the teachings of Greek philosophy, it would lose its dominion over the world. This hard-boiled slave-driver and heartless usurer divined instinctively that culture and world dominion were irreconcilable opposites, either of which could assert itself only at the expense of the other. How completely and stupidly insensitive the Romans were to every higher cultural experience up to the end of the Second Punic War is shown by the cruel and utterly inhuman destruction by the Roman commander Lucius Mummius of Corinth, the loveliest city in Greece. Not content with slaughtering all the population capable of bearing arms, selling the women and children into slavery, and giving the city over to plunder by a rough soldiery, he set fire to it and finally left not one stone upon another. Shortly before, the same fate had been dealt out to Carthage, where flames raged for 7 days, laying waste the land. Over it a plow was driven as a symbol of Roman pitilessness. But despite all this, Rome could not escape the influence of Hellenic culture, and all the warnings of Cato and his adherents were but wasted on the winds. Roman armies could strike down Greece by force of arms, could make Hellas into a Roman province, but they could build no dam against the flood of Hellenic culture. The Roman poet Horace has put his recognition of this into words. Hellas o'erpowered her unlettered masters, carrying art into Latium gently to conquer it. Crude saturnine verse disappeared, finer taste then expelled the harsh and repellent, though long did the traces still show there of earlier rudeness, and have not yet utterly vanished. For the Roman's mind tardily turned towards Grecian letters. After the Punic Wars, languidly resting, he thought to inquire what he could use out of Sophocles, Thespis, and Aeschylus. Soon he was trying to clothe them worthily in Latium's speech. No, Rome could not escape this peaceful invasion of a higher culture, more perilous to the Roman spirit than Hannibal or the incursions of the barbarians. The developing Pan-Hellenism caused a profound change in the rubbishy beginnings of primitive Roman poetry. Whole troops of Greek architects, painters, sculptors, goldsmiths, bronze founders, ivory carvers worked in the palaces of the Roman aristocracy. Among them, many slaves who had been forcibly dragged to Rome. And among these slaves were a large number equipped with all the riches of Hellenic education, who seemed called to bring to their masters a higher intellectual and spiritual culture. For all this, the Romans never progressed in their practice of the arts beyond a slavish imitation of foreign originals. And it is characteristic that in the whole history of Rome, a history of more than 1,200 years, we find not more than half a dozen really great artists, that is, artists inspired with ideas of their own, while almost every Grecian city, Sparta alone excepted, can marshal a whole troop of them. Even the so-called Golden Age has little to offer that can be designated as truly Roman art. Joseph Stragowski has shown conclusively that Roman art in the time of the Empire was merely the last phase of declining Hellenism, whose centers were to be found in Asia Minor, Syria, and Egypt. At that time, there were manifest in Hellenism strong Oriental influences gradually leading to the creation of the so-called Byzantine art, which in its essence was not Roman. Only in architecture did the Romans actually produce a new style, but even here we must not forget that most of the show buildings of the time of the Empire were constructed under the direction of foreign architects. At first, the Romans borrowed their building art from the Etruscans, as is shown clearly by the characteristic form of their earlier temples. Later, when the influence of late Hellenic culture was growing constantly stronger in Rome, the Grecian spirit became more plainly operative in architecture, although the Etruscan type long remained unmistakably present. From the Etruscans, the Romans learned the art of building arches and vaults, which the former had brought with them from the East. It was by the practical application and further development of this art that they were later able to carry through those mighty public works which even today strike us with astonishment. The art of vaulting led, then, in its further development to the construction of the cupola, which presented a new principle in architecture. The magnificent effect of this style reached its highest expression in the Roman Pantheon, the erection of which is attributed to Apollo of Damascus. That in painting the Romans never got beyond mediocrity is known to everybody. They never had any profound feeling for music. As late as 115 BC, the old Roman patriots in the Senate forbade the use of musical instruments. Only the primitive Italian flute found grace in their eyes. Of course, this measure was not permanently enforced. It disappeared before the advance of Hellenism, but even much later music was still consigned entirely to the hands of Grecian slaves. It was quite characteristic that in the field of plastic art, the Romans failed almost completely. Although they adorned their cities with the stolen glories of Greece, they left sculpture entirely in the hands of Hellenic artists, whom they had brought to Rome as slaves. So there developed in Rome the Neo-Attic work, which produced quite outstanding works. All the world-renowned works of that period, the Caryatides of the Pantheon, the Borghese Gladiator, the Venus de Medici, the Farnese Hercules, were made by Greeks. It is true we do not know the creator of the Apollo Belvedere, but there is no doubt that he was a Greek. The bungling efforts of the Romans in plastic art permit no other conclusion. No people is entirely original in its artistic creation. Even the Greeks were intellectually stimulated and fertilized by other cultures, but they used the foreign matter in their own way so that it became a part of their own thought and feeling. This is the reason why, when we look at a Greek work of art, which we know to have been produced under foreign influence, we do not feel the foreign element, or at most perceive only a slight disturbance of the intrinsically Hellenic determination of the work. With the Hellenes, one never feels that they are imitating foreign stuff. Everything is experienced, sympathetically felt inside them. With the Romans, one can generally lay his hand on the imitation at once. This is not a matter of the lack of technical knowledge, it is evidence rather of the utter lack of sympathetic understanding with which the Roman artist really viewed the foreign original. Even during the blossoming period of Roman culture, the educated Roman got no closer to the essence of Greek art. Friedlander, in his Zeitgeschichte Roms, remarks with full justice, "As a matter of fact, in spite of all the old and new artistic pomp of Rome and the Roman dominion, representative art never acquired an influence on the Roman population as a whole. Roman literature, when viewed in its entirety, gives convincing and unanswerable proof of this. Out of so large a number of poets and writers of various periods, most of whom stand at the peak of the education of their period, and serve us as fully accredited representatives of it, hardly one betrays either interest or understanding for formative art. In this so highly varied literature, covering a period of centuries and touching all important tendencies and interests, which during the first centuries after Christ, that is, in the period of the empire before the dominance of Christianity, directed its attention especially upon the present, and even searched into its intellectual status with manifold praisings and blamings, there is found scarcely a trace of understanding of the true essence of art, and no expression of a comprehension of the splendor of its achievements. Wherever it is mentioned, it is either with outright misunderstanding, or at least without warmth or sympathy. However, many individual Romans may have succeeded in penetrating into the essence of Greek art. For Roman culture at large, it remained always remote and strange. This misjudgment of art, which with Cato and the old Roman party passed over into openly avowed contempt, is found everywhere. The writings of Cicero are strewn with contemptuous remarks about art and artists. The gigantic development of slavery in Rome led naturally to a profound contempt for labor, in which the prosaic Romans also included art. A well-known saying of Plutarch is in this connection extraordinarily significant. By the way, this alleged teacher of the Emperor Hadrian was a born Greek, in whose work, however, the Roman way of thinking often achieves surprisingly clear expression. "No respectable young person," says Plutarch, "who sees the Zeus in Pisa or the Hera in Argos, will on that account wish to be a Phidias or an Apelles. For though a work may be acceptable and pleasing to us, by no means follows that its creator deserves our envy." The same phenomena manifest themselves in the literature of the Romans. Despite its many-sidedness, it remains on the whole a literature of imitations. One looks in vain for a Sophocles, an Aeschylus, an Aristophanes. With a few exceptions, it all breathes the spirit of dullest mediocrity. On the whole, literature was in Rome always one of the luxuries of a privileged minority, and was never able to strike root in the people itself. The Golden Age, from 80 BC to 20 BC, offers no exception to this. In Athens, the production of a play by Sophocles or Aristophanes was an event that stirred the whole population. In Rome there was hardly any feeling for such matters, and Horace complains bitterly that the people would rather be entertained by the performance of a rope dancer or a street clown than be instructed by the production of a drama. Like everything in Rome, so also literature served above all the purposes of the state. Cato the Elder declared this openly and devoted a whole work to it. In the time of the Republic, literature amounted to little. Under Caesarism it was in the service of the court. No other literature, therefore, is so filled with the most disgusting flattery of the great ones of the earth as is the Roman. In no other does the spirit of servility and bootlicking display itself so openly and shamelessly. There never was a time in which poet and artist rolled so deep in the dust as in that golden age. A genuine literature was first produced in Rome through Greek influence, on which account the Roman literature has with justice been called a dim reflection of dying Hellenism. What had previously appeared in Rome as literature hardly deserves the name. This holds good especially for the saturnine verses, inartistic holiday songs with meager content and of a wooden lifelessness. An epic such as most peoples possess was altogether lacking to the Romans. There exists no connection between the mythical history of Rome and Roman literature. The attempt to create an epic was first undertaken in the time of the Empire to flatter the vanity of the Caesars. Then came the Fescennines, burlesque wedding songs, usually recited extemporaneously, and later the Atellanes, named for the Oscan city of Atella, in which already Greek influences made themselves felt. But these early starts toward a primitive literature vanished entirely from the canvas when Hellenism made its way into Rome and Greek education became the shibboleth of the privileged classes. The first poets, who are usually regarded as the founders of Roman literature, were Livius Andronicus, Gnaeus Naevius, and Quintus Ennius. 3 Greeks, the first of them a manumitted slave, who translated Homer into Latin. It is a unique phenomenon that a people that played in history such a long and world-dominating part should owe the beginnings of its literature to foreigners. Plautus and Terence, the immediate successors of these 3, were completely permeated by the Hellenic spirit and presented in their work chiefly paraphrases of Greek originals. Moreover, Terence came from Carthage and was brought to Rome as a slave, where he was later freed by his master in recognition of his merit. But the opportunities for the development of dramatic art were not the same in Rome as in Greece, and especially in Athens. In Hellas, the drama was able to attain great heights only because its natural development was subjected to no external restraints. Every art requires the utmost conceivable freedom in order to maintain its life at its full greatness, dramatic art more than any other. Such freedom never existed in Rome. In Athens, there was a most intimate connection between the theater and the public life of the community, and even a Pericles, like any other man, had to endure complacently the attacks from the stage. In Rome, such audacity would have been regarded as an assault upon the sanctity of the state. When one of the first dramatists in Roman literature, the Greek Naevius, dared, in one of his comedies, to ridicule a distinguished patrician, he was forced to make public apology and sent into exile, where he died. For this reason, the drama could never strike root among the people. What interest could the average Roman find in it? The stuff that was presented to him on the stage was borrowed from the life of a foreign people in whose mental and spiritual experience he was not able to participate. Material which would have been able to seize and hold his attention, the representation of the actual occurrences of public life in which he himself was involved, was banned from the stage. The poets of the time of the Republic were completely under the domination of the Hellenic literature, and by far the greater part of their work is confined to the more or less free translation of original Greek texts. The single literary type, which then and later showed a degree of independence, was the satire, especially after Lucilius had given it the form of the satiric poem, in which, of course, he also took his hint from Greek prototypes. Under the Empire, literature fell completely under the patronage of the court. Even its most important representatives, Virgil, Horace, Ovid, Tibullus, Propertius, could not free themselves from these unworthy fetters, and despite their ability, were compelled to burn incense before the emperor and his favorites, and to celebrate their godlike virtues. Thus, the famous and greatly overpraised Aeneid of Virgil, in which he tried, in imitation of Homer, to create for the Romans a national epic, would probably never have been written if it had not occurred to the poet to elevate the Trojan Aeneas to the position of progenitor of the Julian family from which the Emperor Augustus was descended. From the circumstance that Virgil, in his will, directed that his still unpublished heroic poem should be burned, one could almost conclude that the poet had, in an outburst of self-respect, felt ashamed of his debasement. The poets of the Golden Age were separately and collectively dependent on the rich and the powerful in the state, whose favor could be purchased only by self-abasement and contemptible flattery. After Messala, Maecenas, Augustus had gathered about them whole courts of poets who basked in the gracious effulgence of their patrons, It became in time the fashion for every rich upstart to keep his own poets, for whose success he provided, and who in turn attended to his deification. Horace, who always tried to resist the enticements of Augustus, whom nevertheless he deified most unworthily, has confided to us in his epistles how the prosaic need of bread spurred him to poetic creation. Having told us how fate drove him from his good Athens back to Rome, the poet comes to his confession. When from my service there Philippi summoned me homeward, dispirited, wings clipped, robbed of the herds in my pastures, yes, of the pastures themselves, then grim poverty, shameless, drove me to verse-making. Now that I have means to live by, where is there hemlock enough to cleanse me completely, if it should seem to me better to sleep than to make verses? This peculiar confession of one of the greatest Roman poets, which is not wanting in inner tragedy, is characteristic of the conditions of the time. To worm into a poet's post was the dearest wish of a horde of hunger-driven beings who had acquired a more or less thorough education in Greek, and now tried to find a market for it by reciting rhymed flatteries to the great for wages. In the Golden Age, it was practically the profession of the poet to renounce his manhood and become a salaried flatterer of the rich and powerful. One need but peruse the repulsive adulation of their patrons by Martial and Statius to realize to what a state literature had come in that age, when everything was for sale. It is significant that it was just the most horrible and cruel despots who were most glorified by their poets. Caesarism rested like a mountainous weight on the whole of public life. It transformed the nation into a horde of lackeys among whose leaders the poets took first place. The situation became ever more pitiful and revolting as the inner disruption under the shameless dominion of the Caesars progressed. Persius, Petronius, and especially Juvenal have pictured for us the general moral foulness of their time. Juvenal in particular was a first-rate depictor of customs, and his satires, especially the sixth, display an actually uncanny power of description. If one takes the literature of Rome as a whole, one comes to the conviction that it is poorer in independent productions than any other and cannot endure the slightest comparison with the rich and creative literature of the Hellenes. It is entirely dependent on the latter, and its representatives, with very few exceptions, set themselves with a truly slavish diligence at the imitation of the Greeks. Even so splendid a work as the Golden Ass of Apuleius, which without doubt ranks among the proudest contributions of Roman authorship, would never have come into being without the intellectual stimulation and constructive power of the Greeks. The loveliest part of that work, the charming episode of Cupid and Psyche, shows this with the utmost clarity. Only in the writings of history, which appealed more to the practical Roman than did the flowery pomp of poetry, was a certain originality of presentation noticeable, especially when the writer was dealing with events within his own experience. But even here, one must not overlook the fact that the Roman idea lay at the foundation of almost all of the writings. In philosophy, the Romans were even more dependent on the Greeks than in anything else. They enriched the world by not a single idea, but were content to pursue old lines of thought and to reproduce them in weakened form. And one must not think of the schools of the philosophers in Athens and other Grecian cities. Such phenomena were altogether unknown in Rome. Here, no Socrates spoke publicly to all the citizens. Philosophy was at home only in the palaces of the rich, for whom it was the fashion of the moment, as were art and literature. The patriots of the old Roman party fought philosophy with the same virulence they had displayed toward Hellenic art. In 173 BC, the adherents of the doctrines of Epicurus were expelled from Rome. 12 years later, all philosophers and rhetoricians were banished from the capital, because there was recognized in their teachings a danger to the state. The penetration of Hellenism into Rome gave wider scope to philosophy, but its teachers were always regarded with a certain distrust, and persecutions of philosophers, especially of the Stoics, were carried on under almost all the Roman emperors. Of the philosophic systems of the Greeks, only Epicureanism, Stoicism, and Skepticism found wide acceptance among the educated Romans. But the adherents of these doctrines did not enrich the concepts of the Greeks with any ideas of their own. When they attempted originality, they lost themselves in a shallow eclecticism which entirely lacked inner force of conviction. There was a time when Cicero was honored as a profound thinker. Today, it has long been recognized that he never produced a single original idea, but confined himself to preparing the most superficial compilations conceivable from the works of Greek thinkers, many of whom were first thus made known to us, even if in greatly weakened form. Mautner has rightly said, "Cicero would have no place in a history of philosophy, at the most only in a history of the history of philosophy, or a history of philosophical terminology. He whose vanity was almost greater than his later fame had definitely committed himself to dependence on the Greeks, himself poor in thoughts, rich only in unminted words." The illuminating didactic poem of Lucretius, De Rerum Natura, concerning the nature of things, is without doubt a splendid presentation of the doctrines of Epicurus, but it is nothing more. This holds also for the line of thought of Pliny, Lucian, and the other Roman Epicureans. Much the same may be said of the Roman Stoics. They likewise contributed to their doctrine no ideas of their own, and by far their greatest importance lay in the field of political life. Most of the satirists were found among the Stoics, and in Rome satire offered the only opportunity of hurling stones from concealment at the windows of the high-placed. The Stoics strove for a reform in social conditions. For this reason, they sometimes drew upon themselves the wrath of the despots, which often expressed itself in rigorous persecutions. Many of them went pretty far in their ideas. For example, Seneca opposed slavery, and in many of his letters, especially in the 19th, reached genuinely socialistic conclusions. Of course, we must not neglect to mention that one cannot very well harmonize Seneca's life with his teachings. He had to face in the Senate the accusation that he had accumulated his wealth. He left behind 300 million sesterces, say about $15 million, by wangling legacies and practicing the vilest usury. There is no field of intellectual life in which the Romans distinguished themselves by originality and independence of thought. We must therefore count it as a special merit that they had such capacity for appropriating the discoveries and inventions of others, and exploiting them for their own purposes. Their intellectual dependence on the Greeks appears clearly in every field of their scientific activity. At no point did they progress beyond the elementary foundations of Greek science. In many respects they fell far short even of this. This held good especially for their astronomy and their conception of the structure of the universe. From the Alexandrians they took over the Ptolemaic system, by which the inspired conception of Aristarchus of Samos was pushed into the background for a whole 1,000 years, until Copernicus led the human intellect back onto the right path. Of course, in Rome, science too merely served the interests of the state, and in accord with this, all education was also debased, reaching under the empire that state of insipid, outworn windiness that Schlosser has so strikingly depicted. The universal regimentation of the intellect had expelled all vigor and naturalness from life. Science was just the handmaid of vain and vulgar ends. The numerous schools, teachers, and students were victims in equal degree of empty imagination, overbearing pride, false taste, and lack of conviction. Behind the lauded elegance of conversation and the intellectual playing with concepts, ideas, and information lurked hardness of heart, emptiness of soul, selfishness of sentiment, and extremely superficial understanding. A people among whom political effort was rated much higher than any contribution of intellect could achieve nothing different. Just as religion was to the Romans nothing but the epitome of spiritual bondage, so also in the state they revered the principle of political and social bondage, which culminated in the complete subjection of man to the political machine. That the state idea, which with them rested from the very beginning on a military basis, gradually developed into Caesarism and reached its highest point in the elevation of the emperor to the station of an actual god, was the natural consequence of that strict authority principle which will submit to no examination and is inaccessible to every human approach. Rudolf von Jhering, the well-known law scholar, passed his judgment on the Romans in these words: "The Roman character with its virtues and its faults may be designated as a system of disciplined egoism. The chief principle underlying this system is that the subordinate must be sacrificed to the higher, the individual to the state, the particular instance to the abstract rule, the moment to the permanent condition. A people among whom, in the presence of the highest love of freedom, the virtue of self-subjection has still become second nature, is called to mastery over others. But the price of Roman greatness was surely a dear one. The insatiable demon of Roman selfishness sacrificed everything for its ends, the blood and happiness of its own citizens as readily as the nationality of foreign peoples. The world which belongs to it is a soulless world, robbed of its loveliest possessions, a world ruled not by human beings but by abstract maxims and rules. A huge mechanism, admirable for that firmness, the regularity and the certainty with which it operates, for the power which it develops, crushing to bits everything which opposes it, but just a machine, whose master was at the same time its slave. A state whose whole history was founded on the principle of conquest, and which through all phases of its long historical development adhered to this principle with undeviating consistency, came of necessity to a complete surrender of every human consideration. War was its proper element, brutal robbery its life purpose, to which every other was subordinated. Thus came into being that shameful bondage which was in fact the essence of true Romanism, a state in which from the first every citizen had to be a soldier, and in which no citizen could be clothed with public office who had not taken part in at least 10 battles, could but brutalize its population. In fact, the Romans were a people of savage disposition. Even the invasion of Hellenism was able to change this but little, since its influence reached effectively only a small privileged minority and hardly touched the great masses. In 2 fields, however, the Romans revealed an originality of thought and its practical application which no one can justly refuse to recognize, though it is true that these were concerned with social institutions which can hardly be said to have advanced culture. The Romans were the real creators of militarism, and the inventors of that brutal and soulless system which we call Roman law, and which is still today the theoretical basis of the legal constitutions of all so-called civilized states. Roman law, based only on cold-blooded calculation of the most purely material interests, admitting into its theory no ethical considerations whatever, was the natural result of the Roman state concept. The Roman state was a military state, a power state in the strictest sense. It knew only one right, the right of the stronger. Therefore, Roman law could be nothing else than the most brutal violation of every idea of natural right. It laid the foundation for the dreary formalism of our modern law books, in which vital being is smothered under abstract maxims. And this was not changed at all by the so-called equality before the law, which was always a lie practically, and theoretically had in view only the equality of slaves who found themselves at the same level of degradation. Heinrich Heine, who from the bottom of his soul hated the brutal inhumanity of the concepts of Roman law, poured out his heart into these words: "What a frightful book is the Corpus Juris, the Bible of egoism. I have always hated their legal code as I have hated the Romans themselves. These robbers wished to safeguard their booty, and what they won by the sword they tried to protect by the law. Therefore the Roman was at the same time soldier and lawyer, presenting a blend of the most revolting type. Actually, we have to thank those Roman thieves for the theory of property, which had previously been just a fact, and the development of that doctrine in all its despicable consistency is that lauded Roman law which lies at the base of all our modern state institutions, although it stands in glaring contradiction to religion, morals, human feeling, and reason. Never before had any legislation given to the concept of property a form so inhuman, cruel, and egoistic. Property is the right to use and to misuse one's possessions, declares the Roman law. This view, which is still today the legal basis of every exploitation and every economic monopoly, was subject to no limitations except those based on reasons of state. All attempts of later experts in law to cloak or to mitigate the cynical brutality of this declaration have been but futile raising of dust clouds. Proudhon gave this striking expression: "They have tried to justify the word misuse by explaining that it must not be taken to mean an arbitrary misuse in defiance of morals, but merely as indicating the unlimited control of the owner over his possessions. That is an empty, meaningless distinction, which merely serves to accentuate the sacredness of property, and by which the pleasure of possession is neither destroyed nor disturbingly affected. The owner may let his fruit rot on the trees, he can sow his fields with salt, he can pour the milk of his cows on the sand, he can convert a vineyard into a desert, turn a park into a vegetable garden, quite at his own pleasure. Is this all misuse, or is it not? In every consideration of property, use and misuse are hidden together. Who accords to property such power must necessarily rate the worth of a man very low. This is shown especially in the Roman law of debt and in the position given to the head of a family. According to the law of the 12 Tables, a creditor had the right to hale a debtor before the court, and, if no one would go security for him or assume his debt, to sell him into slavery. If several creditors had claims to present against the same debtor, then the law gave them the right to kill him and cut him in pieces. The simple objective fact of the debt was decisive, and no considerations of humanity could be urged against it. The right of possession of an owner stood above the life and freedom of a man. One finds the same pitiless feature also in Roman family law. The head of the house held power of life and death over the members of his family. He could expose a child at its birth or sell it into slavery. He could also pass judgment of death on any of his dependents. On the other hand, a son could make no complaint against his father since he was regarded merely as the father's bondsman. This dependence he could end only by founding a household of his own, which he could do only by his father's permission. Hegel, himself an unreserved advocate of the authority principle, remarks strikingly, "For the harshness which the Romans suffered from the state, he was compensated by the harshness which he exercised in his family. Serf on the one hand, despot on the other. This constituted the greatness of Rome. Its peculiarity was harsh insistence on the unity of the individual with the state, with the law of the state, with the mandate of the state." The whole criminal law of the Romans was one of deliberate brutality and barbarous cruelty. One could object that cruelty in the imposition of punishment was at that time the general custom. But what gives its peculiar tone to the Roman law of punishment is the circumstance that here, too, every detail was patterned on reasons of state, and every human consideration regarded with cold indifference. Thus, in a long series of cases, children could be punished for the faults of their parents, about which the wise Cicero placidly remarks, "The harshness that punishes children for the misdeeds of their parents grieves me, but still it is a wise provision of our laws, for by it the father is by means of the strongest of all bonds, by means of the love that he feels for his children, bound to the interest of the state." These provisions and some others were in later times made milder, but the inner core of their nature was not changed. What was the lot of a slave under such system of laws is easily guessed. The slave was completely without rights, and was, indeed, hardly regarded as human. At best, he was thought of as one who had been human. The slightest disobedience, the slightest insubordination, or even things for which he was not responsible at all, were requited with bestial vengeance. Such an unfortunate might have his tongue torn out, both hands chopped off, his eyes put out, boiling lead poured down his throat. After such unspeakable tortures he might be nailed to the cross or thrown to wild beasts to be devoured. All this by the unquestioned right of the master. The admirers of the Roman state idea make every effort to overbalance the lack of any deep feeling for culture among the Romans, which even they are compelled to recognize, by unstinted praise of the spirit of Roman legislation, which, regarded as a work of art, they find actually astounding. But against this even there is much to be said. No less a man than Theodor Mommsen in his Römisches Gesicht passes the following judgment on Roman law. "Men are accustomed to praise the Romans as the people especially endowed for jurisprudence, and to regard with astonished admiration their excellent systems of laws, as if it were a mystic gift from heaven, perhaps chiefly to spare themselves some of their shame at the contemptible status of their own laws. A glance at the incomparably shaky and undeveloped Roman criminal law should reveal the untenability of these muddy notions even to those to whom it seems too simple to say that a healthy people will have healthy laws, a diseased people, diseased ones. Only such a state could arrive at so completely developed a system of militarism. Militarism and a military establishment are not the same thing, although the existence of a standing army is to be regarded as the first prerequisite of militarism. Militarism is to be appraised first of all as a psychic condition. It is the renunciation of one's own thought and will, the transformation of man into a dead automaton, guided and set in motion from without, carrying out blindly every command without being conscious of his own personal responsibility. In one word, militarism is the meanest and most degraded form of that slave spirit raised to the status of a national virtue, which despises all the rules of reason and is devoid of all human dignity. Only a state like the Roman, where man was valued merely as a mechanical part of an all-assimilating machine and brutal force was esteemed the highest principle of policy, could bring about such a cruel distortion of the human mind, and so lay the foundations of the shameful system that still lies, like a mountain weight, on the peoples, and is even today the deadly foe of all higher cultural development. Militarism and Roman law are the inevitable results of the Roman idea, that conception which is today confusing minds more than ever. No revolution has thus far been able either to chain the Roman idea or to cut the cord that binds us to a long-vanished past. For the Greeks, the institutions of their communal life were a means to an end. In Rome, the state was an end in itself. Man existed for the sake of his institutions, whose slave and vassal he was. Much has been written about the downfall of the Roman Empire, and every conceivable explanation of that gigantic collapse has been brought forward. Some see the cause in the over-refined culture, others in the utter neglect of morals. Nowadays, one school has much to say about a subversion of the soul of the race, whatever this empty phrase may mean, and tries hard to represent the decline of Rome as a race catastrophe, though in this, the fact that Rome itself issued from a so-called racial chaos, which this did not prevent the Romans from playing their historic part in world history to the end, is deliberately overlooked. Yet the actual causes of the downfall of the Roman Empire are much more clearly apparent than are those of most other historical events. If one examines all the details of this gigantic collapse without allowing oneself to be misled by artificially constructed preconceptions, one must reach the same conclusion as the English historian, Gibbon. The wonder is, not that Rome fell, but that the downfall was so long delayed. But even for this delay, there is an explanation. The Roman state machine was so strongly constructed, and men were so universally convinced of its unshakable stability that it, so to speak, ran itself and overcame all obstacles for a long time after its foundation had quite rotted away. Rome was the victim of its own blind power mania and its inevitable accompaniments. Ceaselessly, in deluded blindness, the leaders of the Roman state strove to extend the boundaries of their dominions, and no means was for them too brutal or too revolting. They themselves released the catastrophe that was one day to overwhelm them. The fabulous prodigality of the privileged classes at the time of the downfall, the unscrupulous exploitation of every people, the complete demoralization of public and private life, were not the results of a physical racial degeneration, but the inevitable consequences of that cruel insatiability which had thrown an entire world into chains. The end of such a policy was necessarily complete disruption of all social life. The might of Rome ground to powder everything that came in contact with it, without distinction of people or race. Even the Nordic peoples showed themselves in this matter incapable of resistance, and their Germanic blood offered them no protection against the universal corruption of a system of oppression carried to the bitter end. At best, they could only get the cruel machine temporarily into their own hands, and doing this, they became at the same time its unconditional slaves, and were ground up in its pitiless cogwheels just as all before them had been. The signs of the downfall were clearly recognizable in the time of the Republic. The empire was only the heir of the Republican war policy and brought it to its full expansion. So long as it was concerned with the subjugation of the small populations on the Italian peninsula, there was little profit in it for the conquerors, for Italy was a relatively poor country. But the old conditions were fundamentally changed after the Second Punic War. The enormous riches which flowed into Rome led to the development of a gigantic capitalistic robber economy, which completely destroyed all the foundations of the old social structure. Salvioli, who followed every ramification of this system to its last details, convincingly describes its consequences. After the splendid victories which opened Africa and Asia to the Romans, the realm attained its widest expansion, especially out of Asia, that fairyland of art and industry, that high school of luxury and taste, that unquenchable source of advancement for farmers of state and proconsuls. The most pitiless and brutal force squeezed a stream of gold and silver. This did not cease to drench Italy till the source itself was exhausted. The treasures which had been accumulated in the Orient, in Gaul, in the whole world, and those which the miner's craft still produces today, all were poured together into Rome as spoils of war, as tribute, as the fruit of plundering, and as taxes. All the other parts of Italy received their share, even if a modest one, of the general prosperity. Rome became, and remained for some centuries, the great market for metallic wealth. A raging transport of power-lust and avarice had seized upon this simple warrior-peasant people, so that it measured the fame of its commanders by the quantity of gold and silver that they brought to their triumphal processions, and these made it their practice to bleed conquered peoples white, and to sell to allies the favor of Rome at the highest price they could get. To this avarice nothing was any longer sacred. Right and reason were shamelessly trodden into the mud. King Ptolemy of Cyprus was known to be the possessor of a well-filled state treasury and of royal ceremonial vessels. So a law was promptly passed which gave the Roman Senate the right to inherit from a wealthy ally during his lifetime. The Senate regarded the treasures of all the world merely as Roman private property. The conquered could not call a penny their own. This colossal stream was not allowed to flow in quite without interruption. Victorious commanders, proconsuls, and tax farmers, who were all hungry for the riches of conquered kings and peoples, saw to this. Thousands of traders and adventurers followed the legions, paying cash for the booty which had been divided among the soldiers, and taking from the conquered countries anything the commanders might have left. Thus arose that disastrous regime of speculators and chiselers whose sole purpose in life was gain, and who strove to extract a profit from everything without caring in the least what the consequences were. The most shameful usury developed into a murderous system which, slowly perhaps, but surely, must at last undermine the very foundations of the collective economic life. There arose great capitalists and capitalistic stock companies which farmed from the state the collection of taxes from entire countries and provinces. This saved the state much labor and vexation, but the last drop of blood was pumped out of the veins of the countries that fell into the claws of these vampires, for they spared nothing that aroused their avarice. In the same way they farmed the departments of the state and the mining enterprises from the government, they supplied the legions with the necessary equipment and constantly amassed greater capital. They organized the slave trade on mercantile principles and supplied the great works with their human material. In a word, they were always there, if there was a profit to win. The virtuous men of the Republic participated in these robberies with the utmost complacency, and amassed great fortunes as usurers, slave dealers, or real estate speculators. Cato, who in our schools is still honored as the personified virtue of ancient Romanism, was in reality a shameless hypocrite and cold-blooded usurer, to whom no means was too reprehensible for furthering his selfish ends. He sounded, one might say, the correct note for his time when he coined the saying, "It is the first and most sacred duty of man to make money." Plutarch puts into his mouth as his very last utterance the characteristic words, "The business of the conquerors pleased the gods, but the business of the conquered pleased Cato." Still, Cato constituted no exception among the virtuous Romans of his day. Even the famous tyrannicide, Brutus, whom tradition clothes with all the trimmings of strictest uprightness, was quite as heartless a usurer as Cato and thousands of others, and his business practices were often of so questionable character that even Cicero, that undefeated attorney of usurers and speculators, avoided looking after his affairs in court. By far the most important cause, however, that helped to seal the doom of Rome was the ruin of the small landholders, who had been the strongest bulwark of Roman superiority. The constant and successful wars forced the small peasantry, hungry for foreign riches, ever farther along that dangerous road which has thus far always been the fatal road of the conqueror. The crushing of the Etruscan cities in the north and the conquest of the Grecian colonies in the south of the peninsula had already powerfully stirred the avarice of the Romans. Then, when they first successfully waged war in the outland and began to pursue a world policy, everything else followed of itself. A world policy and a prosperous peasantry are things which in the long run cannot be reconciled. The peasant who husbands his farm is grown into the soil that he tills. Continuous war, with the uninterrupted withdrawal of thousands of men from husbandry, must in the course of time work ever more disastrously. A system under which 25 out of every 100 men were from the 17th to the 45th year of their age always under arms must inevitably lead to the downfall of the ancient peasant husbandry. Moreover, the state had openly raised the trade of robbery to a policy, and this accumulation of wealth by force seemed to the peasants more profitable than the tiresome tilling of the soil. So the peasant gradually became estranged from the land. During the long wars, the Roman peasantry slowly bled to death. Contemporary writers even assert that by the end of the Second Punic War, Rome had lost half of its earlier population. Along with this, small landholding moved more and more swiftly toward its end, and there developed in its stead the latifundia, of which Pliny says quite truthfully that they were the downfall of Italy and the provinces. In the earliest days of Rome, the land question already played a significant role. a fact which found clear enough expression in the long struggles between patricians and plebeians. In this stern conflict, the plebeians at last won equal rights with their former opponents, and the famous Licinian Sextine laws, whose wording has come down to us only in mutilated form, provided that thereafter the two classes should share alike in the division of public lands. The law also provided that the larger landholders must employ a prescribed number of free laborers proportionate to the number of serfs each employed. After the end of the Second Punic War, however, these provisions were in general not enforced. Hundreds of small farms lay quite untilled because their owners had fallen in battle. The state had moreover come into the possession of the vast tracts of land by the confiscation of the property of all the partisans of Hannibal in Italy. The greater part of these fell into the hands of speculators, and land speculation assumed horrible forms. Contemporary writers are unanimous in their description of the base devices by which the small owners were robbed of their holdings. Unsated avarice moves back the boundary stones of neighboring fields. Thou overridest everywhere the peasants' hedges. Outcast wander forth, husband and wife, upon their backs their goods, in their arms miserable children. Even though in some parts of the realm the small holdings were not completely abolished, nevertheless many thousands of small landowners were ruined by the plan for managing the latifundia. The latifundia, when they were not allowed to lie fallow or converted into pasture land, were tilled by so-called serfs, whose lot was the hardest of all the slaves. By this sort of husbandry, the productivity of agriculture was constantly diminished, as always happens with slave labor. Great masses of free laborers, because of this slave labor, were deprived of their means of subsistence, while the importation of grain from Sicily and Africa completely wiped out innumerable small peasants. In the cities, a similar picture presents itself. There, slave industry in the homes of the rich cut off the means of living for small artisans and plunged them into the abyss with the small peasants and agricultural laborers. These latter wandered by thousands into the cities and swelled the ranks of the ruined beggar proletariat that had completely lost the habit of productive occupation and served the state only as bearers of babies. This homeless, idle, purposeless mass, which had become used to living on the refuse of the rich, offered to political adventurers and upstarts of every sort a claque whose paid support was useful to their avaricious plans. Already under the Republic, the sale of their votes had become for the proletariat a comfortable source of income. The rich bought the votes of the poorer citizens and so were enabled to hold the most important positions and to bequeath them to their children, so that certain state offices remained almost constantly in the possession of the same families. A candidacy for a public post was quite hopeless unless the candidate was in a position to bribe the electors by the distribution of gifts or the exhibition of public games, usually gladiatorial combats. Under such conditions, it was inevitable that the influence of victorious commanders upon the course of political affairs should become constantly greater, thus first smoothing the road to Caesarism. In fact, the change from republic to monarchy was accomplished in Rome without any difficulty worth mentioning. Men like Caesar, Crassus, Pompey expended enormous sums in molding public opinion. The later Caesars made use of these same methods, making of the proverbial panem et circenses a buttress of inside politics. Cruel gladiatorial combats had to be used to keep in good humor the depraved proletarian masses of the cities. Thousands upon thousands of the strongest slaves were carefully trained in special schools to slaughter one another in the arena before the eyes of brutalized crowds, or to measure their strength in combat with that of starving wild beasts. Every sort of monstrous horror, says Friedlander, took place in the arena, for there was hardly a form of torture or frightful death known to history or literature that was not offered to the people in the amphitheater for their entertainment. The murderous games often lasted for weeks. Thus it is said that Trajan once had 10,000 slave combatants driven into the arena, where the gruesome exhibition continued for 123 days. What a devastating effect the constant viewing of such revolting cruelty had on the character of the people needs no description. It was a necessary consequence of the continuous wars that Rome became in time unable to enlist from the ranks of her free population enough men fit to bear arms. Julius Caesar had, in fact, begun to incorporate in his armies hired foreign soldiers. Later commanders developed the employment of mercenaries into a complete system and created by its use that military monarchy, the seeds of which the Republic had planted. but the foreign mercenaries, who later were made up chiefly of Celts, Germans, and Syrians, lacked those ideological assumptions in which the ancient Romans were reared and trained. To them, the thievery of the soldier was merely a profitable trade. The Roman idea troubled them very little, since its essence was quite alien to them. Therefore, the Caesars had always to take care to keep their praetorian hordes contented, if they did not wish to imperil their rulership. The last words of the Emperor Severus to his 2 sons, "Keep your soldiers loyal and care for no one else in the world," were the watchword of Caesarism. But since none of the Caesars was quite sure of his rulership and had always to protect himself against rivals from the ranks of his generals and his favorites, the army became a constantly more expensive instrument, and its maintenance a constantly greater burden. And so the praetorians gradually became the controlling element in the state, and the Caesars were often no better than their prisoners. They supported some rulers and hurled others from the throne, according as they saw greater profit from the one side or the other. Every election of an emperor was accompanied by a thorough plundering of the state treasury, which must then be refilled by the employment of every forcible means. Thus, the provinces were constantly, and at ever shorter intervals, squeezed dry like a sponge, and this gradually led to a complete exhaustion of all economic forces. To this must be added that Roman capitalism developed no sort of productive activity, but lived only by plunder, which necessarily hastened the catastrophe. The farther Caesarism proceeded along its perilous course, the larger became the number of parasites who fastened themselves on the mass of the people. It went so far that emperors had to pledge their personal property to the exchequer or to pawnbrokers to raise money for their soldiers. Marcus Aurelius was once compelled, when he needed money, to sell at public auction all his portable possessions, including the art treasures of his palaces and the costly wardrobe of the empress. Others found it more profitable to make away with wealthy contemporaries in order to confiscate their possessions. Nero, for instance, when he learned that 1/2 of the soil of Africa was in the hands of only 6 persons, had all 6 of them murdered so that he might inherit from them. All the earlier attempts to put an end to the evil were without result, and were suppressed by the owning class with bloody cruelty. Thus, the 2 Gracchi had to pay for their daring with their lives, and it went no better with Catiline and his fellow conspirators, whose real objective has never been made entirely clear. And the numerous slave revolts, which periodically convulsed the realm, and of which the uprising under Spartacus seriously endangered Rome itself, were all without lasting result. This could have been because the majority of the slaves were filled with the same spirit as were their masters. Here can be applied also the saying of Emerson, that the curse of slavery is that one end of the chain is forged round the ankle of the slave, the other round that of his owner. The slave revolts in Rome were uprisings of mistreated and desperate men, who lacked any lofty purpose. So, if a brief success was achieved by the revolting slaves, they knew no better course than to imitate the role of their former masters. So utterly had the spirit that breathed out of Rome corrupted men and weakened in them all impulse toward freedom. There could be no talk of a mutual alliance of the oppressed, because even the beggar proletariat of Rome regarded the slaves as inferiors, and so it came about that slaves had to help the possessing class to suppress the Gracchi, and proletarians helped them to put down the revolt of Spartacus. What could be the end of a status where all intellectual power was crippled, and every ethical principle trodden into the mud? As a matter of fact, the whole history of Roman Caesarism was a long chain of frightful horrors. Treason, assassination, beastly cruelty, crazy confusion of ideas, and morbid greed prevailed in tottering Rome. The rich gave themselves over to the most excessive indulgence, and the poor knew no other desire than to be able to participate, ever so modestly, in that indulgence. A little gang of monopolists ruled the realm and organized the exploitation of the world according to well-established principles. At the court of the Caesars, one palace revolution followed another, one bloody outrage wiped out its forerunner, and everywhere peeped the eye of the snooper. No one was secure in his most private affairs. An army of spies infested the land and sowed distrust and secret suspicion in every heart. Never before had the spirit of authority celebrated such triumphs. Rome first provided the conditions for that contemptible status which we might call slavery on principle, and while the spirit of basest slavery was completely unmanning the masses of the people, the delusion of grandeur of the rulers was growing in inverse proportion, because no one dared to oppose their cruel whims. The most honored members of the Roman Senate, overcome with awe, threw themselves in the dust before the god-emperors and paid them divine honors. A Caligula could cause his horse to be chosen a member of the sacerdotal college, a Heliogabalus could have his made a Roman consul. Human cowardice swallowed even this. Upon this road there could no longer be any halt. In insane blindness, Rome had wasted the wealth of the world, and when this was quite exhausted, its power collapsed like a decayed building in whose timbers the worms have long been at work. For such a people, liberation by its own effort was no longer possible, because every earnest resolution, every independent impulse had been crushed out of it. Under the long-continued domination of a power system developed to the point of madness, serfdom had become for it a habit, degradation had become a principle. The revolt against the Roman idea came in the form of Christianity, but dying Rome revenged herself even in her hour of dissolution by infecting with her poisonous breath the very movement in which it seemed that new hope for an enslaved world might be looked for, and transforming it into a church. So out of the world dominion of the Roman state there developed the world dominion of the Roman Church. In papism, Caesarism celebrates its resurrection.
This has been a production of Audible Anarchist. You can find more Audible Anarchist on YouTube.